Hello everybody, it's Rose Patel. Today I'll be discussing how the Chinese Communist Party spent the last 70 years killing its own people and persecuting its minorities. I don't blame the Chinese people for the actions of the Chinese Communist Party, as many of them don't support the CCP. I met many wonderful people in Hong Kong and Macau during my time there. I fell in love with Hong Kong and could have imagined myself living there, if only it weren't so expensive. I also have great admiration for the Taiwanese people. I don't have any hate for the Chinese people. If anything, I feel they deserve better than to be living under a dictatorship. I'm critical towards the Chinese Communist Party, who are responsible for many of the world's worst atrocities over the last 70 years. Within mainland China,
in 1949, after years of civil war, the CCP established the People's Republic of China over the Chinese mainland. The Chinese Communist Party was led by Mao Zedong, a Chinese revolutionary and political theorist. In order to secure the CCP's power within China, from 1949 to 1953, Mao systematically killed between 4 to 6 million people through enormous execution quotas. Many were also sentenced to die in forced labor camps. Furthermore, in order to manufacture iron, Mao demanded that most Chinese civilians melt down their metal items in backyard furnaces. This left much of the Chinese population without farming tools or cooking utensils. The metal was meant to be used to industrialize the country, but ended up being discarded because it was of such low quality. Mao then sent tens of millions of farmers to work in the cities instead of the farms where they were most needed. This resulted in between 20 and 55 million Chinese people starving to death. Mao also ordered the destruction of treasured buildings, sacred objects, and old Chinese customs. Anyone who wanted to preserve traditional Chinese culture was executed. In 1959, Mao Zedong started a campaign encouraging his people to express their opinions on how the CCP could better govern China. The Chinese people followed Mao's request and submitted their ideas. Roughly 1 million of those people were murdered for having opinions Mao didn't like.
In June 1957, he published an article calling the people who had spoken out enemies and rightists. The anti-rightist campaign effectively silenced China's intellectuals. Mao had decided that they were no longer needed.
Between 49 and 78 million Chinese people died under the leadership of Mao Zedong.
in Tibet,
the CCP rules over Tibet with an iron fist. In 1950, Tibet was believed to have had roughly 600,000 Tibetan monks and nuns. However, by 1979, most of them were dead. The Chinese army killed roughly 87,000 Tibetans. They also looted and demolished over 6,000 beautiful Tibetan monasteries.
Year after year, they are forced to watch their beloved religious temples turned into rubble.
Today, only 8 functioning monasteries are left in Tibet. The CCP military and police regularly conduct violent crackdowns on Tibetans who protest their country's occupation. The Buddhist spiritual leader, the 14th Dalai Lama, was forced to flee Tibet and live in India as a refugee.
The Dalai Lama was forced by the Chinese troops to flee in Dharamshala. Now the Dalai Lama heads the Tibetan government in exile from India. Just to see him or touch him, many Tibetans pay with their lives. Dozens of Tibetans are walking in line silently through the mountains of snow, trying to reach India and see the Dalai Lama, their spiritual leader. Everybody can see a Chinese soldier standing in the shooting position. He opens fire. The bullets hit human flesh. Tibetans fall to the ground.
They're shooting them like dogs. Yeah.
The Pro-TV cameraman gets the incredible scenes on tape. He is 1 kilometer away from the Tibetans when he watches another victim falling down. The Danish and the British climbers are simply overwhelmed by what they see.
It's very strange for me to see all this thing happens. I don't know what right the Chinese think they have to do things like this. There's no need to kill.
The Chinese soldiers are smoking, relaxed. For them it's just another successful mission. In spite of what all the climbers witnessed, the Chinese news agency Xinhua announces that Chinese frontier soldiers tried to persuade the group of Tibetans to go home, but the Tibetans refused and attacked the soldiers.
The world says China invaded Tibet in 1959, forcing the Dalai Lama to flee. China maintains it liberated Tibet and last year introduced a holiday recognizing what it calls the emancipation of Tibetan serfs. There is, of course, no mention in the Chinese media of allegations of repression, executions and imprisonment of Tibetans.
These footages now shown around the world are the first images that documented the brutality of the Chinese police. Chinese authorities in Tibet resorted to brutal beatings and torture of the captive Tibetans. About 220 Tibetans died, and over 1,294 were seriously injured. Over 5,600 were arrested, 290 sentenced, and more than 1,000 have simply disappeared. The Chinese Foreign Ministry had rejected the UN panel's report on the widespread use of torture by Chinese police, calling the report as untrue and slanderous in November 2008.
Today, most Chinese citizens consider Tibet to be part of China. Furthermore, they strongly oppose any public figures or world leaders meeting with the Dalai Lama.
I don't think that Obama should meet the Dalai Lama. Tibet is an inseparable part of China. It's unacceptable for Obama to meet the Dalai Lama.
In Inner Mongolia,
On Monday morning, over 100 ethnic Mongolians gathered in Xinhua Square in the center of Hohhot, the capital of Inner Mongolia in northeast China. They were protesting the killings of 2 Mongolians 5 days ago by Han Chinese, and more broadly, the long-simmering resentment over Beijing's governance of the resource-rich region.
This is amateur footage of recent unrest in an ethnic Mongolian territory of China. Triggered by the death of a herder, it broadened into a greater protest against Chinese policy and practices. China's Mongolian territory, named Inner Mongolia, is pockmarked with open-pit mines like this one, and the government has forced its nomads to stop herding.
Videos of students shouting, "Mongolian is our mother language," and storming school grounds are circulating on social media. Protests have been held across the northern Chinese province of Inner Mongolia after new education measures were introduced to reduce the use of the Mongolian language in favor of Mandarin, that's spoken nationally. Many parents have withdrawn their children from schools. Some have clashed with local police. The new educational policy will see the region's main language of instruction changed to Mandarin by 2022.
Mongolian people are worried about their language will go extinct, their culture and identity will be wiped out. In the past 70 years, the Chinese government implemented a series of policies eradicating Mongolian language, culture, and traditional way of life.
Similar changes have taken place in Tibet and Xinjiang. The United Nations says minority cultures are being suppressed.
Chinese Communist Party considers anything other than the Communist Party itself as threat to them. Any organization, any sort of diversity.
In Beijing,
China in crisis, with NBC News correspondent Tom Brokaw.
Good evening. We all knew it couldn't go on forever, but no one thought it would come to this. A brutal massacre of Chinese students and other protesters by the Chinese army. The death count goes on tonight, and it is at least in the hundreds. It may go as high as 1,000 or more, and the fighting is not yet over. China is a nation at war with itself. As a result, the world is a much different place tonight. We've asked NBC's George Lewis to take us through this long, bloody battle.
Tension had been building all day Saturday after some early skirmishes between students and soldiers. Anticipating a major attack, crowds began heading toward Tiananmen Square to reinforce the students who had been sitting there for 3 weeks. The number of soldiers ringing the square increased dramatically, thousands of them taking up positions in the center of town. Some of the demonstrators showed off the scars and bruises they had received in early encounters with the troops. In the early morning hours of Sunday, armored personnel carriers began to advance on the square. There was a volley of tear gas. Then, without warning, the army opened up with bullets, firing indiscriminately at the crowd.
They just killed another one in the square.
People used bicycles, pedicabs, whatever they could find to carry away the casualties. One doctor estimated the number of dead at 500. The doctor said, "My government has gone mad." One official government report characterized the massacre as a glorious victory over counter-revolutionary turmoil. But hardly anyone in this city thinks there's much glory in shooting down unarmed civilians. George Lewis, NBC News, Beijing.
The noise of gunfire rose from all over the center of Peking. It was unremitting. On the streets leading down to the main road to Tiananmen Square, furious people stared in disbelief at the glow in the sky, listening to the sound of shots. And then, as troop lorries were seen moving down the road, there was gunfire from those lorries. The troops have been firing indiscriminately. There was confusion and despair among those who could hardly credit that their own army was firing wildly at them. Many were bystanders, perhaps naive about the savagery of the situation. Indeed, it was hard at times to grasp that this army was launching into an unarmed civilian population as if charging into battle. From Tiananmen Square, the sound of gunfire sounded like a battle, but it was one-sided. A huge volley of shots just as I left the front line caused panic. The young man in front of me fell dead. I fell over him. 2 others were killed yards away. 2 more people lay wounded on the ground near me. Ambulances screamed up to the troop line and were turned away. They couldn't get to the square. 2 ambulance drivers were shot and injured.
In East Turkestan, or as China calls it, Xinjiang province.
Since 2017, up to 1 million Uyghurs have been placed in what some call concentration camps and the Chinese government calls vocational education centers.
Not only has China failed to empty its concentration camps for people's safety, but China has sent massive numbers of Uyghurs to China proper to work as slaves.
They call these Uyghur workers batches. You know, they say they have 500 or 300 workers available to be hired in 15 days. You know, they can be delivered within a week or 2 weeks, and then they can withstand hardship, and they promise if you hire these workers, there will be no staff loss.
Most labor transfers reportedly happen within Xinjiang itself. But increasingly, Uyghurs are being moved from their native regions to China's manufacturing belt in the east, to work in factories in places like Qingdao, Fuzhou and Guangzhou, supplying some of the world's biggest brands. China has used Xinjiang as a testing ground for digital surveillance. Today, the State Department announced sanctions on some employees of tech companies, including Huawei, for involvement in human rights abuse against Uyghurs. The Chinese government is determined that the Uyghurs should assimilate, marry Han Chinese who've been encouraged to move to Xinjiang. They must learn to be obedient communists, to forget their religion and culture, and any thoughts of defying the Chinese state.
People who are members of the Uyghur community have been strongly encouraged not to marry other Uyghurs, but into the Han majority. Analysts say that this is another long-term policy to dilute the population, the Uyghur population in Xinjiang.
China says the camps are for re-education, part of what it calls a struggle against terrorism. But rights groups accuse Beijing of locking up more than 1 million people to brainwash and punish them. Those not detained are spied on. Zumret Dawood says her neighbourhood felt like an open-air prison. She tells how she was forcibly sterilised, along with about 200 other Uyghur women.
We lost a part of our body. We lost our identity as women. We will never be able to have children again.
Many received a prison sentence of years, even decades.
Government efforts to reduce birth rates in Xinjiang are both systematic and ruthless. We are talking the mass forced insertion of intrauterine contraceptive devices. We are talking threats of internment for those who violate birth control policies.
Zenz says the brutal crackdown is part of government efforts to control the Uyghur people, many of whom are Muslim, to purge them of their faith and identity.
In Hong Kong,
for the second Sunday in a row, enormous crowds are marching through central Hong Kong, demanding that the Hong Kong government rescind a proposed extradition bill which would allow alleged criminals here in Hong Kong to be sent up to mainland China. Now, the crowd here is potentially bigger than we saw even last week. Today, as you can see, it's totally peaceful. There are people singing.
Brothers and sisters from my church, they came, so I have to be with them.
Over the weekend, there were brutal scenes of police violence following chaotic protests. Passengers filmed police storming a train compartment, beating passengers, and using pepper spray. Well, we saw scenes of police brutality over this past weekend. How are people in Hong Kong reacting to that?
There is an awful lot of anger among pro-democracy supporters about what unfolded on Saturday. We saw those really dramatic images of police entering train carriage using batons against passengers. It wasn't clear even whether or not they'd been taking part in the protest that day or whether or not they were just caught up in the violence. Now, rather than have that put people off, the fear of being hurt and, of course, the very real fear of being arrested, instead it seems to be fueling this movement even more. People so angry, emboldened even, to take to the streets to fight for what they say is the encroachment of Beijing on their rights here in Hong Kong, and anger against the police at what they say is their mishandling of this entire 13-week protest movement.
Regina, if you say don't jump to conclusions, let's look at China's record. Mass surveillance on hundreds of thousands of people from CCTV cameras, up to 1 million Uyghurs locked up in Xinjiang region, many without charge or trial. Booksellers from Hong Kong disappeared. Doubtless all of them dealt with under the same kind of security laws that are coming to Hong Kong, aren't they? And none of that, you say, necessarily spells the death of Hong Kong's separate system. Of course it does. Look in detail at how Beijing uses its national security laws on the mainland to curtail personal freedoms and snuff out dissident voices. Why should we accept that China is going to adopt this benign attitude that you described towards Hong Kong when its own justice system on the mainland, according to Amnesty International, remains plagued by unfair trials, torture and other ill treatment in detention? Why do you think you'll be able to carry on with the same common law safeguards that you have at the moment? You can't truthfully make that assertion because Beijing hasn't said it will, has it?
In the basic law, it says that all legal systems previously enforced will continue to apply, at least up to 2047. Give me one specific instance of police brutality.
You say that, give you a single example. We saw on video a few months ago a policeman shooting a demonstrator, an unarmed demonstrator, directly in the stomach. You must have seen it as well. Wasn't that police brutality, Regina Ip? The fact is this security law reflects Beijing's paranoia about free speech and freedom in general, doesn't it?
There are people promoting Hong Kong independence, waving Hong Kong flags, chanting revolutionary songs. These are activities that no government would allow. A lot of Hong Kong people are very angry about it.
Chanting revolutionary songs?
Return to law and order.
Chanting revolutionary songs?
Definitely.
You're perfectly entitled to chant revolutionary songs in free countries, Regina Ip. You can go to London or Washington and chant whatever revolutionary songs you want. Why don't you try it? At the end of the day, your reason, your pitch to the people of Hong Kong is trust Beijing. This security law will not be used in the same way that Beijing uses its security laws to tamp down on freedoms on the mainland. This is what you're asking them, to accept that China is not going to behave the way it behaves on the mainland in Hong Kong. Do you really believe that?
Of course. Trust our motherland. Our motherland has nothing but good intentions for the people of Hong Kong, and also trust the basic law, trust one country, two systems, which has worked well in the past 23 years,
We will adopt the most sincere and humble attitude to accept criticisms.
Hong Kong's new security law is in full force with arrests and a very heavy police presence on the ground. Police, in fact, have already detained at least 300 people since the law took effect 24 hours ago. 9 were arrested for violating the law itself. These pictures were shot by our CNN crew in Hong Kong. Just within the past hour, you see people loaded onto buses. Ivan Watson has details of the new reality facing Hong Kong and the stark penalties facing those prosecuted for dissent.
July 1st, 2020 may be the day Hong Kong's autonomous bubble finally burst. A controversial new law dramatically expanding the Chinese central government's powers in Hong Kong was imposed under cover of darkness as riot police began fanning out across the city center. A national security law written behind closed doors in Beijing was only made public at 11 p.m. on Tuesday, the moment the law went into force. The timing hardly a coincidence, because hours later, officials began celebrating the 23rd anniversary of Hong Kong's handover from British to Chinese rule. According to international treaties, Hong Kong was supposed to enjoy relative autonomy from communist-ruled China until the year 2047. But the new law threatens critics of the Chinese government with possible life imprisonment. At a press conference Wednesday, Hong Kong's top officials argued the law would be good for the city's long-term stability. This year, police banned the annual protest march before it even began, and immediately started arresting demonstrators for violating the national security law.
Protesters feared the day China would resort to force, and now it has come in the form of legislation. Beijing will have the power to quash any future protests, and Chinese security services will be allowed to operate on the streets of Hong Kong.
To say that this will mark the end of Hong Kong is a fair statement. It's quite true. It's so bleak, it's so sad, but it's quite true. All our basic core values, all our basic rights will now come under some ruling of separatism, subversion, terrorism, collusion with foreign forces.
This is the clearest signal yet that Xi Jinping wants to hasten complete control.
Despite the extensive media coverage over the years, many celebrities and corporations choose to actively pander to the CCP, as it is very lucrative. Fortunately for me, my ethics are not for sale, so while I support the Chinese people, I cannot support the CCP. To any Chinese and Hong Kong citizens who are facing this adversary, Jiayou and Gayao, I hope this video provided some clarity on my stance. If you enjoyed this video or simply found it informative, please remember to like, subscribe, and ding the bell in order to get notifications for our upcoming content. It's been Fatally Honest. Ciao.